The first time Ethan heard the ringing, it was so faint he thought it was just the echo of a memory, a phantom vibration in his pocket. But when he stopped walking and stood in the silence of Ashwood Cemetery, he realized the sound was real, sharp and tinny, muffled beneath the ground. It was past midnight. The fog had rolled in heavy, and the rows of leaning gravestones stretched endlessly before him, their names almost swallowed by moss and time. He should have turned back then. He knew that. But curiosity pried its claws into him, and so he followed the sound through the damp grass until he reached a crooked stone with no name, only a cracked surface covered in lichen. The ringing was coming from beneath the soil at its base. His heart hammered hard, his breath catching in his throat, but he dropped to his knees, digging with trembling hands until the wet earth filled his nails, and then his fingers struck something hard and cold. He pulled it free, wiping mud from the screen, and saw that it was a phone, slick with dirt but glowing faintly as it continued to ring. The number was blocked, the screen cracked, but the light of it cut through the dark like a pulse. Ethan stared at it, frozen, his instincts screaming to throw it away. But something in the way the phone vibrated against his palm, as though it clung to him, made him press the green button. He lifted it slowly to his ear, his voice low and unsteady as he whispered hello. For a moment there was nothing but static, a deep rushing sound like wind roaring through a tunnel, and then a voice came through. It was hoarse, broken, but unmistakably human. It said his name, not just once, but over and over, each time a little clearer, until the syllables dripped with familiarity, as though the speaker had been waiting for him. Ethan felt his mouth go dry, his pulse roaring in his ears, and he stammered out a question, asking who it was and how they knew him. The voice did not answer, only laughed, a low, rattling laugh that shifted into sobbing, and then whispered, "I am not finished." The line went dead, the phone going black in his hand as if it had never been alive in the first place. Ethan stood, mud streaked across his jeans, his body trembling as he shoved the phone into his pocket. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the fog had pressed closer around him, muffling every sound except the pounding of his own heartbeat. He walked quickly toward the gates, trying not to look at the shadows that seemed to move between the stones, but with each step, he took the ringing started again, muffled, distorted, vibrating against his thigh. He pulled it out, the screen glowing bright, and this time, it did not wait for him to answer. The phone clicked on by itself, the speaker hissing with static before the same voice whispered again, softer this time, almost gentle. "Do not leave me here." He froze, turning in a slow circle, the mist swallowing the world beyond a few feet, and he swore he saw movement behind the gravestones, a pale figure half hidden, watching him. The phone buzzed again, the voice more urgent, repeating those same words, "Do not leave me here." And against his own reason, Ethan turned back toward the nameless grave. The fog parted like a curtain, and there it was again, the cracked stone leaning forward as if bowing under some unseen weight. He felt drawn to it, his feet carrying him forward despite the tremor in his chest. The phone screen flickered, the voice growing harsh, guttural, the words twisting into a plea, "Dig deeper." Ethan knelt once more, his hands plunging into the cold mud until he hit wood. His breath caught. It was a box, a small one, waterlogged and rotting, the smell of decay rising as he pried it loose. His stomach churned, but he pulled it free, and as he opened it under the sickly glow of the phone's light, he saw bones inside, small and brittle, the remains of a child. Nestled among them was another phone, identical to the one in his hand, its screen glowing faintly with a cracked smile drawn across it in scratches. Ethan dropped the box, bile rising in his throat, but both phones lit up at once, ringing in unison, the sound shrill and endless. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward, and the earth beneath the grave shifted, the soil sinking as though something stirred below. Ethan turned to run, but his foot caught on a root, and he fell hard, the phone in his hand pressed against his face. The voice screamed this time, loud and furious, "You let me out!" And with those words, the ground split open, dirt spraying as skeletal hands clawed their way into the air. Ethan screamed, dragging himself backward as a figure pulled itself free, small and broken, its limbs bent wrong, its empty sockets glowing faintly in the dark. It crawled toward him with jerky, unnatural movements, its mouth opening wide to release the same shrill ringing that poured from the phones. Ethan staggered up, sprinting toward the gate, the fog so thick now it felt like a wall pressing against him, slowing him down, the ringing chasing him with every step. He burst through the iron gates at last, collapsing onto the street beyond, gasping for breath, his body trembling with terror. For a moment, the world was silent, the night air cold but clear. The phones gone from his pockets as though he had never touched them. Ethan staggered home, his mind a storm of fear and disbelief, trying to convince himself that it had been nothing but a hallucination. But when he reached his apartment and locked the door, he heard it again, faint at first, then louder, coming from his own kitchen drawer where his dead phone lay. He pulled it open with shaking hands, and there it was, glowing bright, though its battery had long since died, ringing with that same numberless call. His reflection in the black screen did not move with him. It smiled instead, wide and sharp, as the voice whispered from the speaker, "I told you not to leave me here." The lights in his apartment flickered, the ringing deafening, and Ethan dropped the phone as every other device in his home lit up at once. Their screens cracked, their tones overlapping into a single horrific shriek. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed the room was his reflection crawling out of the screen, its eyes black voids, its mouth stretched impossibly wide as it whispered his name. The lights in his apartment flickered again and then went out completely, plunging the room into a suffocating black that seemed to press against his eyes, thick and heavy. And yet the glow of the phones remained, scattered across the floor where he had dropped his own and where others had somehow appeared, devices he did not own, old flip phones, cracked screens, even rotary phones that should not have been able to light up at all, their shadows long and warped against the walls, as if the light they cast belonged to something not of this world. Ethan's chest heaved, sweat dripping down his forehead as he backed into the corner, his hands trembling. But the ringing never stopped, louder now, echoing from every surface, vibrating through the floorboards, until his teeth ached. He covered his ears and screamed for it to stop, his voice breaking, but the phones only grew louder until the sound became a solid wall of agony pressing in on him from every side. Then, just as suddenly, silence fell. Ethan dropped his hands slowly, chest rising and falling as he gasped for air, and in that silence, he heard a faint scratching. He turned his head toward the sound and froze. From the screen of his television, dark lines appeared, as if claws were dragging themselves across the glass from the inside. The scratching grew louder, frantic, desperate, and then a face pressed against the screen from within. A pale child's face with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Its mouth opened wide in a scream that shook the glass, and Ethan staggered back, hitting the wall, unable to look away as the screen cracked from the pressure. One sharp fissure after another split across the surface until the glass shattered outward, the pieces clattering across the floor like teeth. From the broken frame the child crawled through, limbs jerking, head lolling unnaturally, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too long, its mouth still frozen in that scream though the room was silent. Ethan tried to run for the door, fumbling at the lock, but the knob burned hot beneath his hand, the metal searing his skin. He yelped and stumbled back as the child's head snapped toward him, its hollow sockets focusing on his face though it had no eyes. Slowly, mechanically, it rose to its feet, every joint cracking loud in the silence, and stepped toward him, dragging one leg that bent backward at the knee. Ethan's heart hammered so violently he thought it might burst as he grabbed a chair and hurled it at the creature. The wood passed straight through, splintering against the floor, as though the figure were half-formed, not entirely real. It smiled then, a wide, unnatural smile, and with a voice far too deep for its body, it whispered the same words that had haunted him since the graveyard. "Do not leave me here!" The walls of his apartment began to pulse as though they were alive, the wallpaper bubbling outward like flesh, and from each swell another screen pushed through, glowing faintly before erupting with static. Ethan spun, looking for an escape, but every surface now reflected that same grinning child, each image moving slightly out of sync, as if dozens of versions of it existed and watched him at once. His phone vibrated in his pocket again, though he swore he had dropped it on the floor, and against his better judgment he pulled it out. This time the screen showed not his reflection but his apartment, the very room he stood in. Only in the image he was not alone. Behind him in the phone's vision stood another figure, taller, shadowed, its long fingers reaching slowly toward his shoulder. Ethan whirled around. His breath caught in his throat, but the room was empty except for the child now standing inches from him, its smile splitting wider to reveal jagged teeth that had not been there before. It lunged at him, passing through his chest like smoke, and Ethan collapsed to his knees, clutching himself as ice filled his veins, his breath frosting in the air, though the room was sweltering with unnatural heat. He coughed violently, the taste of dirt and rot filling his mouth, and when he looked down, his hands were black with soil, clumps of earth falling from between his fingers. He gagged and stumbled to the sink, turning the tap, but what poured out was not water. A black sludge oozed into the basin, thick and writhing with movement as though insects swam within it. He screamed, backing away, and his heels struck something solid. Turning slowly, his heart stopped. In the middle of the living room now sat the same rotting box he had unearthed in the graveyard, only larger, its wood swollen and broken, and the lid was slowly rising. A hand reached out, bony and trembling, and then another, and a figure began to pull itself free, taller than any human, its frame impossibly stretched, its skull scraping the ceiling as it stood fully upright. Its face was obscured in shadow, but Ethan knew without doubt it was the same entity that had followed him from the earth, the one that had whispered his name, the one that had begged not to be left behind. It bent toward him, its long arms stretching unnaturally as it pressed a hand against his chest. Ethan's breath stopped, his vision swimming as he felt something being pulled from him, something vital. His screams filled the apartment, but were swallowed by the shrill ringing that erupted once more, vibrating through his bones until he thought his skull might crack. The creature leaned close, its voice seeping directly into his mind rather than his ears. "You opened the grave. You brought me home, and now you are mine." Ethan tried to fight, his body convulsing, but the strength drained from him as his vision went black. The last thing he saw was his reflection in the broken shards of glass across the floor. Only, it was not him. It was the child, smiling, holding a phone to its ear as though listening to his screams. When Ethan woke, he was lying in his bed, sunlight filtering faintly through the blinds. For a moment he thought it had been a nightmare, the kind that claws at you with such vivid terror that you wake drenched in sweat and shaking, but nothing more. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, and tried to steady his breathing. The room was silent, calm, ordinary. He almost laughed, almost convinced himself of relief, until he noticed the dirt on his sheets. Black soil, clumped and wet, smeared across his blanket. His chest tightened as he followed the trail with his eyes, leading down to the floor where muddy footprints stretched from his bed to the door. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached for it. The screen lit up, cracked where it had never been cracked before, and a message appeared across the display. "Do not leave me here." Ethan's scream never reached beyond his walls. Neighbors later said they only heard ringing, endless ringing that went on for hours. When they knocked on his door, no one answered, and when at last the police entered his apartment, they found it empty. Empty, except for dozens of old phones scattered across the floor, each one cracked, each one glowing faintly with the same text burned into the screen. "Do not leave me here." Ethan was never seen again. But on quiet nights in Ashwood Cemetery, among the leaning stones and drifting fog, some say you can hear a phone ringing faintly beneath the earth, waiting for someone else to answer.